Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Girard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Hello, and welcome to Killer Women Podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air global network with more than 4 million listeners. I am your host, suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Carol LaHines. Carol's
Hi,
debut
Danielle.
Carol's debut novel, Someday Everything Will All Make Sense, was a finalist for the Nilsen Prize for a first novel and an American Fiction Award. Her fiction has appeared in literary journals including Fence, Hayden's Ferry Review, Denver Quarterly, Cimarron Review, the Carolina Review, the Chattahoochee Review, Sycamore Review, Permafrost, Redivider, Literary Orphans, and Literary Latte. Carol lives in New York City. Welcome, Carol.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. It's so fun. So let's talk about the vixen Amber Holloway. Can you tell our listeners a
Yes.
little bit about the story?
Sure. So it's about a Dante professor who descends into darkness, some might say madness, after her husband leaves her for another woman. So it's structured as a jailhouse confessional, similar to Lolita, which is definitely one of my favorite all-time books. And so I've always wanted to do my own kind of version of that narrative, both in terms of having a first person kind of unreliable narrator. You're not exactly sure where to trust her. And she's narrating after the fact. Obviously, if it's a jailhouse confessional, she's in jail. She's having many conversations with the prison psychiatrist. She's basically narrating what transpired after her husband left her, and she kind of went off the rails. So
yes, off the rails a bit.
That's
And
a way to put it.
that is a way to put it. And she has a kind of interesting psychology to start with, right? I mean, so tell us a little bit about her, because I think
Sure.
she was sort of set up to go off the rails from her own childhood.
Exactly. So she keeps returning to this pivotal incident when she was 8 years old, where her mother ran off with the used Cadillac salesman, Bob. And that actually, it's something I kind of borrowed from like writers do, from a story I'd overheard when I was younger, where there was this mom in the neighborhood that, one day she was there at the barbecues and one day she disappeared. And no one really told us what had happened. And then we later found out she basically ran off, you know.
Right.
And it was so, out of the blue and kind of inexplicable. So I kind of used that as a springboard for the incident. And because it's, I was an undergrad psychology major. So
Okay, yeah.
definitely very, very fascinated in people's psychologies. I almost became a psychologist myself. So
Yeah.
I think I've always had this lingering fascination. And in her mind, that's kind of like the pivotal life incident
Right.
that got re-triggered by all of this. So all her kind of psychological apparatus from that time comes back into play.
Right. Abandonment, right? I mean, like the worst for her, the worst possible thing is abandonment. And here
Right.
her husband does it. You can see, how it would trigger a a break, if you will.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So tell us, it sounds like Lolita was a big inspiration. How do you come up with your ideas? This is your second novel. Where do you find your
Mm-hmm.
sort of inspiration? Obviously, you stole a little bit from your own something you'd heard as a child, and my puppy is gonna want to be on my lap here. Georgie's joining the
Hi.
show today. Okay, sit down, buddy. So tell us about your process and sort of where these ideas come from.
Yeah, I mean, they come from, they come from real life. They come from stories I read in the newspaper.
Hmm.
They come, from all over the place. And for me, they usually start with like the voice and psychology of the person. I don't necessarily, I actually prefer not to know exactly what's going to transpire, have like a kind of general idea, but not
Hmm.
to overly predetermine, at least in my first drafts. And that's, people's psychology, like where they're in denial, what their, blind spots are. Those are things that really fascinate me.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes, like I said, for this book in particular, because I felt like for a long time I was trying to find my kind of Nabokovian narrator that could
Yeah.
do a jailhouse confessional. So that was definitely a direct influence here. And the thing I love about Humbert, even though what goes on here is very different than what transpires there,
Right, right.
is
There's no
that,
pedophilia in this book.
yeah, no pedophilia here, but that kind of level, like a certain level of self-delusion. I mean, honestly, we're all self-deluded,
Of
it's
course.
just
Of
it's just a
course.
question of degree.
Right.
But that level of both being hyper articulate and kind of intellectual in some ways, but yet really kind of not understanding your drivers or motivations, like, and
Yeah,
your
like being out
unconscious.
of touch, right? She's a very isolated person. I mean, I think partially, of course, because her name is Ophelia, which I also love.
Yeah.
Partially because of how like what happened to her growing up, right? And she wasn't. It's interesting these people who are only children, right? I
Hmm.
always feel like if you have a sibling to sort of to reflect your parents off of, it helps you sort of
Right. Right.
understand your parents, and if you don't, um, then of course you just internalize all of that as being sort of on
Exactly.
you, right?
Yeah, it's like a form of reality testing. If you have
Mhm.
different people around you that narrate the event, and you could sort of put together all the various accounts, and you realize, perhaps you're looking at it the wrong way, or maybe you're looking at it the right way, or whatever. But if you have no check, you can really become kind of lost in your own.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
Now, is this part of the where I mean, so you said you were an undergrad in psychology. Is that also part of your sort of, what you do? Are you a full-time writer? Is this part of or is psychology part of your sort of life day to day?
Um, Not in a what I would say professional way, although I do think as writers we really, really deal with people's psychology a lot. I mean, and that's what
Sure.
kind of makes books ring true to life,
Right.
is to just fully inhabit, like some other consciousness. But yeah, I actually had a very strange, I mean, undergrad, I majored in psychology and music, believe it or not.
Yeah.
Um, and I minored in classical literature, like Dante,
Right. Right.
the Greeks. And then I actually went to law schools,
Uh,
and I was a practicing lawyer for a good 10 years. And now I actually do some work for the appeals court here in New York, but I'm not
Okay.
practicing anymore. But that it also fascinates me because, when you're dealing with, especially appeals, you get like one version of the facts and another completely contradictory version of the facts.
Right.
And you're always trying to figure out like what is really going on. And
Right.
that's always fascinating to me, is constructing narrative so the reader really gets involved and has to figure out, what's going on here, and like she says this, she says that. And I think that um it's fascinating both on a character level and just kind of on a story level to
Yeah.
see.
And
Yeah.
you can see that your legally experience in the book as well. It shows up in terms of, how the court aspects of the,
Right.
because obviously there's she ends up in jail. So there's
Yeah.
a court
Yeah.
process with it too. And it's funny because, the book is really about, I mean, the title of the book is about the mistress. Amber
Right.
is the mistress, right? So the
Right.
whole thing is sort of, um, it's I guess like Lolita, right? It's
Yeah.
projected onto the
Exactly.
external character, which is really fun.
Exactly. Because they almost create the character. Like if
Right.
you look at Lolita, which he actually, Lolita's kind of like Humbert's own private name for her. He's kind
Hmm.
of, she's a person, but he's projected so many things onto her and fixated on her that is what he's interacting with, really her, or, his fantasy construction of her.
Right.
And it's interesting when you have a narrator like that, to show, and you do see, like in Lolita, when she's talking in her adolescent way in the car, or other things going on, that that you realize like his view of her is so detached from, the
Yeah.
actual perception.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is true of Amber too, right? We see
Yeah.
when we really get to know Amber, she seems like this, perfect woman and this model of, and I think that's so natural, right? I mean, when you see, I mean, I'm just recently divorced. So, you see this, you project what you think your
Mm-hmm.
ex is doing, and you imagine it to be this like, oh my God, she's so much like an improved version of me. She's everything that I
Right.
wasn't, and it just how it feeds into our own insecurities about being, abandoned or left. And it is, it's so human nature. So, I mean,
Exactly.
Ophelia's on her own level, right? Clearly. I mean, one of the things is she's so isolated, right? There's nobody,
Mm-hmm.
again, there's
Mm-hmm.
not the friends to really like, people try to kind of be the person to bounce off like what's reality, but she's
Right.
really very much in her own ninth circle, as you will. So
Yeah.
um it's super fun. So tell me, when you wrote the book, is it, you said you don't really know kind of how things are gonna, obviously you
Right.
knew she'd done something horrible because which,
Right.
because that's the kind of book you're writing and also sort of where things are headed, but you don't know sort of how it ends up. And when you finish your first draft, how close does it end up to sort of what we read?
I normally, I won't start writing until I have a somewhat clear conception, like both of the character, the voice, and the overall arc.
Yeah.
Because I want it to at least be embedded, kind of that there's kind of a velocity toward a certain end.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I don't want to be like groping around for that. So I definitely had that when I started writing it. I had her voice, and I find like, and I do in my first draft. I tend to write very quickly and almost in a kind of hallucinatory way.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't mean like uh, I'm not like what I call a binge writer where I'll write like 8 hours in a row or anything.
Right.
Like I write
Right.
like hour and a half every day. It's really regular. It's kind
Yeah.
of like I have a limit. I just
Yeah.
reach a certain point and I don't push it because it's just goes down, after
Right.
that. So, but because I do it so regularly, like for a first draft, like for a book this length, I can do it in like, 4 to 5 months range. Like this one
Mm-hmm.
I think was like 4 to 5 months for my first draft. And
Yeah.
I want it to have like that kind of integrity of that point in time, like instead of kind of stopping and starting and stretching it out. And then
Right.
I will definitely poke at it a lot, you know, because then I
Yeah.
start getting very analytical about it, but when I'm doing a first draft, I try to stay out of my own way,
Yeah. Right. We
and not
can get
judge
in
what's
our own
coming
ways.
out,
Yeah.
because especially like I tend to write real characters that are really kind of dark or in extremis in some way. And I don't want to, because I find sometimes, writers will get in their own way and kind of censor things like it's not so nice what's happening, and I don't want to
Yeah.
do that. I want to just
Right.
kind of let it out and then I'll worry about it later.
Yeah.
So that structure was there. Like I started, the psychiatrist, I think I kind of knew I was going to put the psychiatrist in there, but then like where it took off from there, like I knew like where it was heading for the final kind of confrontation, but not exactly how it would play out.
Right.
Like I said, but certain things that happen along the way, like when she gets really traumatized by things and kind of goes into third person talking about herself, like
Right.
that
Right.
that just happened, as I was
Yeah.
writing. And then I just was like, okay, I'm going to keep this in here. And then, I did it recurringly thereafter. So I think that, it's part of the fun of the process. And
Right.
sometimes the best things come out just totally sideways when you're not expecting them.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I try not to like get in my own way. I mean, that's normally a problem for me, is to just keep my analytical mind out of it,
Right. Well, it's fun too.
Yeah.
I mean, we talked about that a tiny bit before we started recording, is the idea that she does write, there are two points of view, and there's a sort of like logical, there's the kind of fully in her
Hmm.
own, like rooted in reality part where she talks about sort of what happened, and that's first person past tense. And then
Right.
there's this sort of secondary third person present tense
Right.
about sort of
Right.
where she's clearly losing touch with
Yeah.
reality, and that, to differentiate those not only by, tense but also by point of view is really interesting. That just had sort of happened, you're saying.
Yeah. 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 Because I am fascinated with the way, stories intersect and get layered, and where does the truth lie
Right,
amidst all that? So that
right,
was I mean, you kind of have that dual level built in just by virtue of doing the jailhouse confessional structure, because you're narrating stuff in the past. Supposedly, you've had like a certain number of years to kind of process
right,
it,
right.
you know.
Yeah, she's up for parole is really what this is,
Right.
sort of how this is being, which is, yeah, super interesting, right? Because as we read, we're like, hmm. Um, but yeah, no, I really enjoyed that. And is that something that, again, like, sort of just happened naturally, but you decide as soon as you saw it sort of on the page, you're like, this really works, right? Because it does
Y-
really help the reader distinguish between, sort of what she believes. Again, we're sort of,
mhm.
it's all still filtered through an unreliable narrator, but what she
Right.
believed happens, and what's going on in her mind right now, neither of which we're quite
Yeah.
sure of, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because part of that whole parole process is you have to acknowledge, your culpability and kind of have insight into what you did. So that's kind of the occasion, the narrative occasion for her going over all of this. And I mean, that happens in Lolita also. I mean,
Yeah,
that's kind of, and so I think to a certain extent, at certain points where I broke out into, when she's almost kind of um, in a like imagined way addressing the jury, trying to
yeah,
explain herself. Like that's the type of thing that also goes on in Lolita, where Humphrey
yeah,
talks to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, and it's a way of kind of implicating the reader too, like into the
yeah.
whole process. And
Right. Like, if you were a juror, what would you do? Right.
right, right, which is an uncomfortable feeling, so it's, yeah. So it
Yeah.
was a lot of fun. I think part of, some of it just kind of arrived organically as I was writing. I'm
Yeah.
sure, like when I went and looked back at it, I could definitely see antecedents in Lolita from what I did, since that was kind of my narrative model.
Yeah.
Um, and then I mean, one of my earliest teachers, would make us do, like these 2-3 page writing exercises, and they'd always be based on, some famous writer or whatever, some
Right.
piece of writing, and we dissect, like what is it that makes this narrator the way they are. And people always think initially like, oh, I don't want to copy someone or sound like someone, but the thing is, you could go line by line and try to mimic whomever, like whatever writer, and it
Right.
always ends up you're infused in there, like it just
Yeah.
never, you know
No, and
so
I haven't thought about using like a classic as a model, but I think we all use each other, like, we all use other books as, like, oh, the way that they start the book, or the speed at which they do it, or the way the character, the
right.
different types of, it's like you said, this is a jailhouse confession versus like journal entries or whatever. I mean,
Yeah.
we're all
Yeah.
borrowing, because there's nothing completely original in the world,
No,
right? It all comes
exactly.
from
And some
something.
structures are so, I mean, another structure that really fascinates me is that kind of structure in The Collector, which is about another deranged person, right? But where it's like first you get the point of view, like first person account of what happened from the kidnapper,
Hmm.
and then it just switches, halfway through, and you get the kidnappee, I don't know what you call it, kidnapped
Right.
person. Um, and it's so fascinating because obviously he fixates on entirely different things than she does. And in her
Right.
section, she's clearly trying to just not think about what's actually going on and distract herself mentally with her life before, and just
Right.
like almost an imagined fantasy escape, so she doesn't have to think about the horror of
Or
what's happening.
right.
But I think like those type of structures really, can throw that into relief in a way. Like that structure in The Collector was really ingenious because it could just work so much more powerfully than if you tried to do a braided narrative or whatever, like
Right.
just other forms.
Right.
So I think about those types of questions a lot, like what is the structure, not so
Yeah.
much the, yeah, I mean, structure is distinguished from plot. I mean, plot is, what's
Of
going to
course.
happen, but there's a structure
Hmm.
of how we're going to get at this kind of psychological situation.
And did you do the same thing in your first book? Was there a structural and sort of a unique, I haven't read that yet.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay. Yeah. So that character isn't necessarily criminal, but he is neurotic. It's a first person male narrator, and he's a professor of medieval music. And he's sort of like this 40-year-old guy that lives with his mother, and his mother dies like by choking on a wonton on the first page. So, and it's a, like this one, it's definitely a dark comedy, so I knew I wanted him in that situation, and it's his version of the stages of grief, and then, like I said, it's a dark comedy, but and so there's aspects in there too where there's a lot of kind of play with the situation going on, which again, it's kind of like this, death. It's but in that case, he's kind of trying to rail against the nonsensical nature of life, basically at the end of the day, and these things that happen out of the blue, and like she choked on a wonton. I did that kind of on purpose, and someday everything makes sense was the message of the fortune cookie. But so it's just these random things that happen in life, and he's just struggling through all of that. And that case actually did involve, that book did involve this kind of fake lawsuit in there where he sues the takeout that brought him. Yeah. And it's so like over the top ludicrous because it's just absurd, so I mean, that level of absurd, I mean, that those type of situations interest me, I think, because in some ways you can get at the pathos, so much more through the comedy than if you attack it.
And I mean, to be honest, like it's totally absurd. Of course, logical people will be like, you can't sue over a wonton, but it is also something that people do, right? We like it, and you lose somebody or something like that happens. There's this real desire to blame somebody, to have some sort of sense of like, this isn't my fault. It can't be her fault because she's dead. So now it has to be somebody's fault. Whose fault can it be? Yeah, that is, I can see how that is. And so how did you attack that one in terms of structure? Did it have its own sort of,
it has
role?
More of a straightforward structure because it doesn't have the dual timelines like that.
Yeah.
But there's sort of like forward motion with this ridiculous lawsuit that he has. And kind of the voice and reason in that novel is his girlfriend, who's a therapist. Like, and she kind of is the voice that's always saying, that there's not necessarily a reason why, and he fights that,
Right. Well, we want a reason. Of course we do.
Right.
We want to understand it, right? Our brains want to take what is illogical and make it logical, of course.
Yeah. And I mean, in all sorts of situations. I mean, that is definitely a fascination of mine as a writer. It's like how characters just try to make sense of these things.
Can you tell us, are you working on something now?
Yeah, I finished a few after. I always tend to be writing like a first draft at the same time I'm editing other stuff. So the one I'm actually working on now is it's kind of loosely based on the series of killings we had on Long Island. If you're familiar with this like Gilgo Beach killer that they found.
Tell us about that.
He basically was leaving that there, he had murdered a series of, mostly like prostitutes, people that unfortunately that were off the radar. They didn't connect a lot of the dots. There was a lot of botched police work. For a while they thought, I think at some point in time they were diverted onto another suspect who ended up not being the suspect. So the killer all this time ended up being just this like architect or something, like just this kind of ordinary middle-aged
professional person.
With a family. And so again, like those type of situations fascinate me, but it's this book has different structural elements. Like I started with a section from a detective, and then there's like a crime reporter. It doesn't get to like, now I'm actually doing the section of the killer,
Yeah.
So it has like different, you're kind of coming at it all these
Yeah,
different
different
angles.
parts. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. That's fun.
And
I mean,
yeah,
and so you just, for this one, you just sort of, had that been niggling in your mind a while? Like, do these things sort of seed
yes,
and sort of grow for a bit of time before you sort of start?
absolutely. I mean,
Hmm.
I think, during the pandemic, like a lot of people, I think I just read and reread a lot. And
Hmm.
one of the things I reread that really, you know, um, tripped this kind of idea in my mind was 2666 by Bolaño, which,
Hmm.
you know, is sort of, I guess it's 5 parts about these killings of women who worked in factories in Mexico. And
Yeah.
it doesn't start like with the obvious, and his is definitely more kind of like, except in the fourth part, removed from the killings. I mean, it deals with
Right.
like these scholars that, are sort of peripherally related, but there's always this undercurrent of kind of violence throughout. So there's
Mhm.
incidents that happen where it just kind of bring to the fore the kind of violence at the heart of, especially like male on female violence.
Yeah.
So you develop this just sense of like like the atmosphere and this sense of growing dread, like um
Even before you meet the killer.
right, right.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's sort of like each part stands alone, but then you kind of, they all, the way they fit together. So that definitely, together with the case, that they kind of like sparked in my mind. And that's, but
And
yeah,
have you been, like in terms of like sort of this, now that you're writing a detective in particular, like how are you researching that? Is there somebody, have you spoken to them? I mean, they're usually pretty
yeah,
open to talking in generalities about what they do. Is that something that are
yeah,
you
I
just reading about
definitely,
it? Yeah,
um, my search histories are so, I don't
I
know, like if
know. We'd
anyone,
all get
I'm
arrested.
sure we
Yeah.
all have this.
Yes, we do. The FBI is watching us.
Um, I researched a lot about the case. I didn't want it to be like a true crime in the sense
Right.
that but just sort of how they did the investigation,
Hmm.
how what they found versus like what they misunderstood about the evidence, how they finally caught the killer, like all that stuff,
Right.
which was being reported more and more when they finally actually, I mean, I think at the end they sort of matched his DNA on a pizza box. I mean, in some like
Yeah.
ridiculous way, like
It's
they
amazing what they can do now. Right. Thank
yeah.
God. But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, now apparently if you have a second cousin on Ancestry, right? Like they will
Right.
find you. Like
Yes, I love that. I love what's happening with with
yeah,
the familial DNA. I think that is
yeah,
really fascinating. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Well,
So
that's fun. It's fun that you're doing it as. So, do you have sort of similar? You sort of like the 5 parts. Are they? Is that sort of what you set up? You're like, okay, I'm going to sort of emulate the structure of this book, and so I'm going to create my own 5 parts. And
yeah, I think I'm gonna end up having more than 5 parts, but I wanted to do it that way where you first come at it obliquely, and each of
mhm,
these characters, like the detective or the reporter, have their own kind of haunting backstory. So that's
right.
what's fun about doing it too, because they're pursuing the killer, but they have their own things, so
Which
it
is
kind of
true of
close.
all of us, right? I
Right,
mean, I
right.
don't think you become a detective without some sort of, that's a really hard job, right? So you don't probably
Yeah,
do that unless you have some sort of connection to, police work or death or, crime. I think that is interesting. And reporting too is
yeah,
a
yeah,
field where people go into to answer questions about things. And like writing, right? We all have
yeah,
some
exactly.
sort of something we're trying to figure out, and the way we do it is by writing about it.
Exactly. And the irony of that case too was that the case that sort of sparked the investigation and ultimately led to the killer, they have not definitively linked her to him, you
Oh,
know.
interesting.
So it's like because they were looking for this one woman, then they uncovered like the
All these.
remains of all yeah. So
Hmm.
it's just fascinating how, like again, it was just kind of happenstance that
Hmm.
that that the mother of that particular victim hired a detective to investigate, and that's what sort of led to the realization that the investigations of various killings have been botched
Yeah,
by
that there were a bunch of
yeah,
victims that had been sort of overlooked, which is also very true to sort of the way things actually work. So
Yeah.
so interesting. Well, I love that. It makes me think in a new way, because I haven't, especially since you're talking about you're talking about like these older classic literature, not,
Hmm.
James Patterson wrote a book that gave me an idea
Yeah.
about how to structure something. It's very, and those are sort of for sure, Lolita is the sort of original, um, I mean, it's the original sort of that kind of story, right? With the sort of the predator who deems
Yeah.
himself not a predator. It is interesting. So
Right. Right.
it's fabulous. That's
Yeah.
wonderful. Now, I'm not familiar. Tell me about your publishing, sort of how you went about. Have you been with the same publisher for 2 books? Is this the second book with this?
This is actually two different small
Okay.
publishers.
So how is that?
Um,
Yeah. How has that worked for you?
so, and when I first started, I've been writing a long time, like I'm sure
Yeah.
most of the writers.
Yeah.
So initially I wrote almost entirely short stories because at the
Hmm.
time I was working a lot more,
Yeah.
I had a day job. And so then I just started publishing in, literary journals and things like that. And I did that
Yeah.
for a long time. And at some point, I want to say like a good 10 years after I started writing stories, I started thinking about longer works.
Hmm.
And, which occasioned much. I think when I was writing stories, I wasn't, if I had considerations of structure, I think they just kind of happened more organically, or I didn't
Yeah.
really, when you're writing a longer thing, you really have to think about
Yes.
architecture in a different way.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not like a long short story, it's a different DNA,
Yeah.
so, and I want to say the first 2 or 3 things that I seriously started, I just, left in a drawer. They were kind
Right.
of,
It's hard. It's a totally different experience. Yeah.
yeah. So, but I think kind of the seeds of things I experimented with in those books, I can definitely see them in the
Hmm.
books I
Oh
actually ended up
yeah.
publishing. And so I always think like with writing, there's never like a wasted endeavor, because
Mm-mm.
there's always some, like the character in my first novel came out of like another novel, and then just certain things that I've done in novels were things I experimented with, and ones that I just ultimately deemed not going anywhere.
Yeah.
So I think that's just like the way we teach ourselves,
Yep. I
you
think,
know?
and it's the sort of the Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours, right? You got to do it a certain amount of time, whether it's successful or not, to really understand how it works. And so I think that's absolutely right. And I think a mistake a lot of people make, first time writers, is to just rewrite the same story over and over and
Absolutely.
over. And I think there's a point at which, like, I get it, because it's like your baby, it's your first story. But I also think there's a point at which you have to really just set it aside and start with something new.
Absolutely. There's a point of diminishing returns for sure.
Hmm. Hmm.
Both in terms, that's why that's one of the benefits I feel just writing every day and writing, like where I can produce a book a year roughly, because
Yeah.
it's not like I'm totally invested in it. But if I have to put it aside, or my agent thinks, this one is like, I'm fine with that. Because
Right.
it enables me to like not feel like, oh my God, I spent 10 years doing that.
Right. Everything rides on this one book. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
I think you have to have like that level where you can just, rationally look at your work, and it's like, is this one? Yeah. So, there's plenty of,
Yeah. It's the kill your darlings thing, right? It's like
absolutely.
this is not, yeah, this is not, it means a lot to me, but it is not, yeah, it's not doing what it needs to do in order to sort of appeal to a broader audience. So yeah, that takes a lot. That's a lot. I feels like like, I think my 29-year-old self, which is when my first book came out, that was a lot harder than it is now for my, in my 50s. It's like, okay, like, this is not working, or somebody says we probably need to do it this way, and I can now be like, oh yeah, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, it's experience. It's total experience. It's interesting because when I was writing this book, which this version of it is pretty faithful to my original conception,
Hmm.
and
That's,
then I went to, writing workshop over the summer, whatever.
yeah.
And, I feel like this is also why it's important to get your first draft out first before you
Yeah.
start hearing, other
Yeah.
influences. And it's funny because certain of the things that I thought, okay, people are saying, this or that. There's definitely other versions of this that exist that it kind of went in a circle. Like this draft is sort of like third, fourth-ish draft. I went to kind of like draft 8 or whatever.
Yeah.
And then I actually ended up going back
Mhm.
because when I handed it to my agent, like she had, I don't know, like 6 or 7 comments, and every comment that she had was something that was existing in like the third
Yeah,
draft.
but you'd edited it out.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah, because so I really do think that there's a point where it can be detrimental when you're, yeah. And it takes
Yeah.
a while to learn that, like when
Yeah.
you need to listen and when you need to just trust your instinct as a writer.
Yeah. And every book I think is different. For some books it takes 8 drafts, and for some books 8 drafts takes you beyond where you needed to be. So
Exactly.
yeah, it's that's the other problem, is it's such a subjective business, right? You have to sort of, that's why you really need a trusted reader, like you said. And it's also, as you mentioned, I think really important to get the draft to be sort of what you want it to be first. And then, because otherwise all the voices, you could take a book. I mean, this same
Yep.
story could go a million ways, right? It just isn't, there's no sort of one right. It's not a math equation. So it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's super exciting. Well, this is, so Carol, tell, first of all, I do love the cover.
Yes.
For those of you who are just listening to us, you have to go and look at the cover, because it really is a great depiction of the story. Tell our listeners where they can find you online.
Yeah, I have a website, which is just my name, basically Carol LaHines, all together, no spaces, .com. And, my website has all my information about events or like for book clubs, or, I have some of my stories up on there that you can just read. And that's probably the best place to reach me, and I'm obviously on Twitter or X, whatever it's called now,
Yes.
Instagram,
Yeah.
all variants of my name, Linktree. This book is coming out June 11th. So, and it's available in all the usual places, Amazon, Bookshop, from the publisher. So
that's right. And today, this will be our episode will go live on May 30th. So you still have 2 weeks to go and get your copy, pre-order it. So it'll be delivered on June 11th. And super fun. LaHines, I will spell for you just in case, because it's, I don't know, we could probably spell that a bunch of ways too. It's LaHines. So it's capital H, but all one word. So when you're searching for Carol, that way you'll know how to spell it. Carol, this was so fun. Everybody, it is, I makes me want to go back and read Lolita, because it is interesting that there are some.
I actually have it on my desk right now because I'm taking a Lolita class, which is also really fascinating, rereading it again. Now.
I'll bet. I love it. And I love that there's all those courses available to us, like, right, just on, you can do all that stuff online, and the pandemic also opened all those doors for us to get, to continue to sort of pursue things from our safe home distances. So The Vixen, Amber Holloway by Carol LaHines. Thank you so much for joining us today, Carol.
Thank you, Danielle.
Everybody, this is Killer Women, and we will see you next time. Bye.